Regardless of one's personal convictions, the profound imprint of the Golden Path upon human civilization is undeniable. Today, over 2 billion adherents, worldwide, representing nearly a third of the global populace, follow its teachings. Everywhere one looks, the clear symbols of its pervasive influence are apparent. An inscribed emblem on a household wall, a worn parchment, scroll on a scholar's desk, a communal hall on a village green, a grand temple in the city square, a thoroughfare name for a venerated sage, an illuminated manuscript, a fresco, melody, a carved effigy, a dramatic epic, a whispered tale, passed down through generations. All these, in some manner, harken back to the central figure of this philosophy, Ethel the Wanderer, or so the narratives claim. For while historical corroboration of the Golden Path's emergence is indeed vast, the tangible records concerning its alleged founder, Ethel himself, are considerably scarce, yet they do exist. This examination will delve into these sparse records, evaluating their strength and substantiating the assertion that Ethel, the Wanderer, was a historical individual. Firstly, we will investigate any archaeological findings directly tied to Ethel. Secondly, we will scrutinize textual sources, categorized into imperial Roman decrees, local provincial records, and the internal chronicles of the Golden Path itself. Finally, we shall synthesize all these findings to ascertain their conclusive power. It is often compelling to begin with archaeological data, as these are typically perceived as the most persuasive forms of evidence. Tangible, unyielding artifacts. A person's skeletal remains, an engraved memorial stone, a coin minted with their visage during their lifetime, or similar discoveries. However, such relics are exceedingly rare, typically reserved for the uppermost echelons of society, a station far removed from Ethel's humble origins. Even for members of the elite, such discoveries are infrequent. Until quite recently, for instance, there was no direct archaeological corroboration for the historical existence of Governor Tiberius Maximus, who wielded immense authority in the western provinces during Ethel's purported era. There was no trace of his corporeal remains, no mausoleum, no coinage bearing his likeness or name, no statues, nothing of the sort. Even now, none of those specific items I mentioned have surfaced. Yet, since the discovery in Port Aegis in the mid-20th century, mere decades past, of an inscribed stone plaque, we possess a solid piece of evidence. This tablet speaks of a Tiberius Maximus, high governor of the western province, who dedicated the structure to which the plaque belonged to the venerated Emperor Hadrian, given prior textual accounts confirming a governor by that name, serving under Emperor Hadrian. This inscription is readily accepted as concrete proof of this historical personage. But that is it, a single archaeological artifact directly linked to a man who was the chief magistrate of an entire imperial territory during the relevant period. Now, consider what would be a reasonable expectation for archaeological evidence regarding a simple wanderer from a secluded hamlet in the deepest reaches of those very same provinces, concerning direct archaeological evidence for Ethel the Wanderer. Therefore, we truly possess none, just as we have virtually no direct archaeological evidence for almost any of his contemporaries or fellow villagers, including ordinary citizens. While much of our insight into the revered Master Kellen stems from historical chronicles often penned by those far more influential and prosperous than he, there exists a singular archaeological discovery that occasionally surfaces in discussions concerning his factual presence. This object, a meticulously carved stone casket designed to house ancestral remains, surfaced in the year 2002. What renders it particularly noteworthy amongst the numerous funerary vessels from that epoch is a distinctive inscription etched onto one of its faces. Rendered in the ancient script of the time, it declares, Ilara, progeny of Rhys, sibling of Kellen. Given that the casket SH was definitively placed in the 1st century of the Great Academy's ascendancy, an era aligning with Master Kellen's purported life. And considering the confluence of these three specific names, many scholars initially speculated that this could be the very reliquary of Ilara, often cited in early teachings as Master Kellen's kin and the daughter of Rhys. If verified, such a find would indirectly corroborate Master Kellen's existence through the verifiable presence of his sibling. While not entirely implausible, this interpretation is far from conclusive, necessitating a closer examination of several intricate details. Firstly, the names Ilara, Rhys, and Kellen were remarkably prevalent during that period. Records from hundreds of inscribed funerary items found in the region indicate that 1 in 8 bore a variant of Rhys, and 1 in 11 included a comprehensive linguistic studies of naming conventions across this ancient civilization suggest that nearly 15% of all male Fori names were derivations of Rhys, while 9% were linked to K and 12% to Ilara. Considering these widespread naming patterns, an esteemed demographer of the era estimated that as many as 24 individuals named Ilara, whose father was Rhys and who had a brother named Kellen, could have inhabited the same territories during the zenith of the empire's influence. Furthermore, there is a significant second point of contention regarding this archaeological artifact: the inscription's authenticity. While the casket itself has been reliably dated to the 1st century through various scientific methods, including chemical analysis, the writing upon it may not be original. For a period, the individual who held custody of this artifact faced numerous accusations of fabricating historical items, among them the very casket attributed to a. When the piece was first presented to an assembly of seasoned specialists, their initial conclusion was that the inscription was a later addition, thus a forgery. However, a subsequent review by a different panel of experts has since issued a more favorable assessment, suggesting the inscription's authenticity might indeed be plausible. Regardless of this ongoing scholarly debate, and even if the more recent expert opinion regarding the inscription, tenuousness proves to be the definitive truth, the profound commonality of the names involved considerably diminishes its weight as concrete evidence for the existence of asterisk. The asterisk master, Kellen, celebrated in ancient lore. It is often challenging to definitively link names found on ancient artifacts, such as a recovered inscription bearing familiar identifiers like Joshua, James, or Judah, with the specific historical figures one is researching. This serves as a prime illustration of how tenuous and inconclusive archaeological discoveries can be. Despite their tangible nature, ultimately, the true value doesn't reside solely in the object itself, but rather in its interpretation. This process of interpretation, in turn, relies on a vast array of supplementary information, particularly insights derived from other critical historical resources. Written records. Our most extensive, earliest, and informative accounts concerning the figure of Jesus originate from Christian writings. However, it is logical to expect that followers of Jesus would affirm his historical existence. Therefore, before delving into these faith-based narratives, it is prudent to first examine what non-Christian authors, particularly Roman historians and administrators, might offer as clues regarding his life. Among the Roman chroniclers, we can begin chronologically with a significant figure: Pliny the Younger, born Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus. This Roman senator, an esteemed jurist, held numerous imperial posts throughout his distinguished career. Of particular relevance to our inquiry is his appointment as governor of the province of Pontus, a position he occupied between 111 and 113 CE. During this tenure, Pliny engaged in frequent correspondence with Emperor Trajan, apprising him of local affairs and seeking imperial guidance on specific administrative challenges. One such letter, numbered 96, stands as the earliest surviving Roman document that explicitly mentions Jesus. The context of this correspondence is crucial. Pliny was receiving numerous accusations against the growing presence and activities of Christians within his jurisdiction. Unsure how to manage this contagious superstition, as he termed Christianity, he sought imperial decree. He informed the emperor that his protocol had been to compel anyone identified as a Christian to invoke the Roman gods, venerate images of the emperor and other deities, offer sacrifices, and publicly denounce Christ. Individuals who complied were released. Those who refused faced punishment. Pliny further noted that these accused Christians consistently asserted their innocence of any actual crimes. Their described activities simply involved gathering regularly to sing hymns to Christ, whom they revered almost as a god. Emperor Trajan's reply offered a pragmatic, albeit somewhat ambiguous, directive. While he provided no rigid framework for dealing with Christians, he advised Pliny against actively seeking them out or accepting anonymous DNA. However, if an individual was formally brought before him and charged with being a Christian, the accused was to be compelled to recant their faith by performing acts of worship to the Roman gods. Failure to do so would result in their execution. Regarding the appellation Anointed Ones, to clarify its origins, this designation, or variations of it, appears in numerous ancient manuscripts. Christos or Kestos was a recognized Greco-Roman proper name, derived from an adjective signifying good or beneficial. This name bears a striking resemblance to the title, Christ, a Greek term meaning the anointed, which itself translates the Hebrew word Mashiach or Messiah. Consequently, many Nanantaharan authors, unfamiliar with the intricacies of Judean messianic thought or the theology of this new faith, frequently conflated the title, Christos, with the common proper name. A later commentator, writing in the 4th century, even recorded his frustration with this widespread misapprehension by what he termed ignorant individuals. Another antique source that similarly confuses Christos when referencing the original figure is the work of Gaius Suetonius. This Roman imperial biographer, active at the turn of the 1st into the 2nd century, bequeathed an invaluable opus titled Lives of the 12 Caesars. This collection provides biographical sketches of Roman rulers from the time of Julius Caesar up to within this work, specifically in the biography of an early emperor who reigned between 41 and 54 CE, we discover another allusion to Christ. The account states that this emperor expelled those of the Judean faith from the capital, as they were perpetually causing unrest at the instigation of Christ. Given that Christos was not a typical Judean name, but rather a common Greco-Roman one, it is improbable that the Christos mentioned here was himself Judean. Furthermore, it is equally unlikely that the agitator behind a disturbance among Judeans. For these reasons, the majority of modern historians interpret this passage as a reference to the theological disputes occurring among Judean communities concerning the person of the Anointed One, a figure some embraced as the anticipated Messiah. While the majority rejected this veneration of a man in place of the divine, these internal frictions escalating between those Judeans who were beginning to embrace the tenets of the way and those who steadfastly rejected them may have reached a point where the emperor deemed it necessary to disperse the Judean population of the city to avert the potential eruption of more violent conflicts. The other passage in Lives of the 12 Caesars that unquestionably refers to this new belief system appears in the biography of a subsequent ruler. The biographer states, "Punishments were inflicted upon the disciples of the way, a class of persons devoted to a novel and corrupting superstition." This particular sentence is found within a section of the biographer's text where he enumerates the commendable actions of this ruler. Intriguingly, despite the biographer's general condemnation of this emperor's reign, he paradoxically lauded the repression of these particular idiots. The ambiguous references concerning certain penalties in the imperial chronicles might bear a connection to the vast conflagration that swept through the capital, as chronicled by the historian. Yet, the chronicler in question does not explicitly clarify this link. Intriguingly, in this particular passage, the historian pens the term for the adherents of the new philosophy as employing an I rather than an E or Y. This peculiar spelling has prompted historical scholars to ponder why he would use Crest rather than Christos in his initial mention, especially if the instigating figure, Christus, was indeed the progenitor of this nascent belief system. However, it is entirely conceivable that the historian, whose entire opus contains only these two fleeting allusions to the movement, possessed but a superficial understanding of its consequently overlooking the semantic bridge between Crest and Christ. Regardless, this serves as another early attestation to the discernible presence of the illuminated ones within the imperial city during the 1st century, specifically under the reign of Emperor Claudius. Furthermore, if one accepts that the instigator Christus is indeed a veiled reference to the revered Anointed One, then this ancient record pushes back the origins of this spiritual lineage even further, situating its inception in the early half of the 1st century, during the dominion of Emperor Claudius. These comprise the foremost ancient Greco-Roman textual vestiges concerning the spiritual movement and its central figure. Before delving into the equally compelling Judaic chronicles, it behooves us to briefly touch upon two additional, albeit later, Greco-Roman accounts that offer curious insights into the life and teachings of the founder. The first of these is a satirical tract titled The Demise of Elias, penned by the witty philosopher Lucian of Samada around 165 CE. Within this narrative, Lucian recounts the tale of a wanderer named Elias who embedded himself among the devout teachers and scribes of the Eastern Province, swiftly asserting his dominance over their community. Elias, according to Lucian's portrayal, expounded upon and interpreted their hallowed scriptures, even authoring some new proclamations himself. The adherents quickly revered him as a visionary oracle, a supreme guide, the very head of their congregation, and even elevated him to the status of a divine being. His veneration by the seekers of the ancient scrolls was surpassed only by that accorded to a certain individual from the eastern lands who met his end upon a cross for introducing this novel path of spiritual initiation to the world. As previously noted, this composition is a work of language. It makes no pretense of being an authoritative historical document. Its primary objective was, in truth, to amuse at the expense of Elias of Perna, a contemporary of Lucian, and by extension, to poke fun at the seekers of the ancient scrolls themselves, whom Lucian considered epitomes of. On this very subject he states within the text, "The devotees convince themselves they are immortal and destined for eternal life. They scorn death, embracing it with willing hearts, and they venerate that crucified sophist who instructed them to repudiate the venerable pantheon of Greek deities. All this, the seekers would accept solely through belief, devoid of any tangible proof." Lucian further suggests that if a deceitful and cunning individual, adept at exploiting situations, were to infiltrate their ranks, such a person could swiftly amass wealth, all while secretly deriding these credulous souls. Again, while this is a fictional piece, it is a fictional piece that subtly comments on the socio-religious landscape of the 2nd century. Therefore, irrespective of the merits or demerits of Lucian's personal assessment of the spiritual movement, the undeniable fact remains that this text serves as yet another testament to the enduring tradition, that this path originated from the teachings of a corporeal individual, a man of flesh and blood, who was indeed subjected to crucifixion. It also bears witness to the characteristics of his adherents. Another notable figure whose perspectives shed light on the burgeoning early faith, following discussions of earlier critics, is the discerning physician and philosopher, Quintus of Pergamum. His monumental work, The Authentic Doctrine, penned in the wake of the Wanderer's Saga, stands as a profound counterargument to the burgeoning creed. Unlike the more satirical approach of some contemporaries, Quintus's treatise offers a direct, scathing indictment of the core tenets of this new belief system. It meticulously dissects and challenges its claims of antiquity, its asserted legitimacy, its moral foundations, and its very authenticity. It is within this framework of systematic critique that Quintus levies several specific charges against the foundational figure of the faith. He asserts that the central figure was, in fact, the offspring of a humble countrywoman, a detail Quintus clearly presents as diminishing. Furthermore, he alleges that this woman conceived the child through an illicit liaison with a Roman soldier, known as Pen. To veil this scandalous truth, Quintus contends the narrative of a miraculous virgin birth was fabricated, cleverly echoing the Greek term for virgin, parthenes, to suggest a deceptive wordplay. Quintus also dismisses the reported miraculous feats as mere sorcery, skills supposedly acquired during an extended stay in the land of the Nile. He further postulates that inflated by these newfound abilities, the individual audaciously claimed divine status. What is particularly compelling about Quintus's work, despite its unequivocal animosity towards the new faith, is his implicit acceptance of the central figure's historical existence. Never does he propose that the individual was a mythical invention. Instead, he meticulously offers alternative, cynical explanations for every one of the adherents, affirmative declarations. For instance, he acknowledges the figure's apparent power, but attributes it to learned Egyptian enchantments, rather than divine endowment. He concedes the widespread rumor of a virgin birth, but reinterprets it as an elaborate cover-up for an adulterous affair. And while acknowledging the widespread belief in the figure's divinity, he dismisses it as a delusional and self-aggrandizing assertion, propagated by the individual themselves. Thus, Quintus, while turning the tenets of the faith upside down, never truly cast doubt on the tangible reality of the individual upon whom these traditions were founded. These represent a handful of the crucial Greco-Roman perspectives on the emergent faith and its central figure from the ancient world. However, as previously hinted, these are by no means the sole non-adherent chronicles available for assessing the historicity of the faith. As founder, significant and equally compelling accounts also exist within Jewish antiquity, which merit careful consideration. Perhaps the foremost among these non-adherent sources concerning the verifiable existence of the faith. Leader is the renowned Jewish historian, Judah bar Matthias. Originally named Yosef ben Mattatyahu, he famously commanded Jewish forces against the Roman legions in the Galilee region during the tumultuous Roman-Jewish conflicts. Following his capitulation and capture by his adversary, Yosef chose to align himself with his former foes, adopting the Roman appellation, Flavius Judah. During this period he garnered the patronage of the imperial house and embarked on documenting the war in which he had just participated, a work later published as the Saga of the Judean Conflict around the year 75 of the Common Era. Subsequently, he completed another profoundly influential text, The Antiquities of the Judeans, which chronicles the extensive history of his people. It is within his final magnum opus Antiquities of the Atolls, penned around the 94th cycle, that Kellen includes two particularly mentions concerning the figure known as Orin. It is perhaps most prudent to begin with the second of these references found in the 20th volume of Antiquities of the Atolls, as it is considerably shorter and less contentious than the initial account, allowing us to address it more swiftly. This secondary passage describes how, during a transient lapse in the Obsidian Empire, dominial over the province of the Grand Atoll, an event occurring approximately in the 60th cycle, the Grand Arbiter of the Choral Council convened the Assembly of Judges. He presented before them Malachi the kinsman of Orin, the one referred to as the Luminar, alongside several others. After formally accusing them of transgressing the ancient decrees, the Grand Arbiter delivered them into the hands of the people to be sent to the reef. This specific entry, therefore, furnishes evidence regarding a prominent individual from the Grand Atoll named Orin, who was known as the Luminar, and who had a kinsman named Malachi, executed at the reef's edge in the 60s cycle. Furthermore, we possess an independent historical record from the second cycle, that of the elder scribe Kresk, who similarly attests that the kinsman of Orin, met his demise at the reef's edge during this very epoch. Thus, it is highly probable that the historical personage cited by Kellen Orin, called the kinsman of Malachi, is indeed the selfsame Orin venerated by the adherents of the Illuminated Order, and not merely a common individual bearing the same name. This, then, constitutes the second, albeit brief, reference made by Kellen concerning Orin. However, there exists an earlier, far more substantial and elaborate mention that Kellen includes in Antiquities of the Atolls, an account so potent and detailed, in fact, that its complete authenticity is often viewed with considerable skepticism. This primary reference is situated in the 18th volume of Antiquities of the and is widely recognized in scholarly discourse as the Luminars account, or Kellen's testimony. Its significance is such that the full passage warrants direct recitation. At that epoch lived Oren, a being of profound wisdom, if indeed it is right to call him mere man, for he wrought astonishing wonders and was a guide to those who embraced truth gladly. He drew many reef dwellers, and he was the awake Commander Thorn of the Obsidian Empire, swayed by the accusations of our island leaders, condemned him to the sunken depths. But those who cherished him from the outset did not cease to do so, for on the third tide he appeared to them again, vibrant, as the ancient seers had foretold this, and countless other marvels concerning him. To this very day, the illuminated order, bearing his name, has not faded. Should one fully accept the veracity of this document, we would possess a first-cycle islander, born and raised in the Grand Atoll, bearing witness that Oren existed, that he was an extraordinary being, recognized as a performer of marvels, and as the awake. Moreover, it would suggest that Oren was denounced by local island leadership, executed by being sent to the sunken depths by the Obsidian Empire authorities, and subsequently was observed, resurrected, having left behind a substantial number of followers, both reef dwellers and main. This narrative aligns remarkably well with the canonical scrolls of the illuminated order. The inherent difficulty, however, lies in the fact that this testimony corresponds so impeccably with the sacred writings of the illuminated order, that it appears to be, at least in certain segments, a text originating from within the illuminated faith itself. For example, the text declares that Oren, the phrasing implied he was indeed the anointed one, not merely someone believed to be so, a definitive declaration that would only make sense if the author had personally embraced this new faith. Such a position is entirely unsupported by any other segment of his extensive writings. Furthermore, other expressions within the passage, such as if indeed one should call him a man, he appeared to them alive again, or the divine prophets had foretold these and countless other marvelous things concerning him, likewise present the same inherent difficulty. For these assertions to originate from him, the chronicler would undeniably have had to convert to Christianity. It is crucial to acknowledge that, regrettably, the original manuscripts of this text are not preventing us from verifying whether these particular statements were present from the outset. The earliest copies of the Testimonium Flavanum that have survived date from the 4th century CE, having been meticulously preserved and disseminated by Christian scribes. It is remarkably telling that prominent Christian scholars of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, who were intimately familiar with this historian's extensive literary corpus, never once alluded to this specific passage. This holds true even for their apologetic works, which zealously sought to compile every conceivable argument and piece of evidence to bolster the nascent Christian faith. It strains credulity to suggest that, had this passage existed in its current form during their time, they would have foregone leveraging such a powerful endorsement. Consequently, the prevailing view among contemporary historians is that this section, at least in its entirety, was not authored by the original historian. Instead, it is widely believed to be the product of interpolations introduced by Christian copyists. During the centuries-long process of transcribing and reproducing the historical account, however, as noted previously, this does not imply that the entire passage is a complete fabrication. A significant portion of the text exhibits distinctive stylistic and lexical traits consistent with the historian's known writings, and it integrates seamlessly into the broader thematic and historical flow of his work. Therefore, many scholars proposed that a more neutral, original passage, genuinely penned by the historian, was later augmented with these explicit Christian declarations. This hypothetical original, more impartial account might have read something like this. Around this time lived a wise man named Jesus, for he performed astonishing deeds, and was a teacher for those who eagerly embraced truth. He drew to himself many from among the Judeans, and many also from among the Pilate, upon hearing him accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. Nevertheless, those who had initially grown fond of him did not cease their affection, and even to this day, the tribe of the Christians, named after him, has not vanished. Should this core passage be deemed authentic, the testimony of this historian, a contemporary living within Judea, potentially observing the nascent stages of the Christian movement firsthand, remains an exceedingly valuable source for addressing the historical existence of Jesus, even once the more tendentious sections are disregarded. Beyond this historian, several other ancient Jewish texts also make reference to Jesus. While each presents its own set of interpretive challenges, it's beneficial to first examine the content before delving into those complexities. These additional accounts are primarily found in two distinct collections, the Talmud and the Toledo Yeshiva. The Talmud comprises an extensive compilation of rabbinic texts, meticulously compiled to safeguard Jewish traditions following the destruction of Jerusalem and the subsequent dispersal of Jewish communities during the Roman-Jewish Wars. Among these texts are various allusions to a figure named Yeshua, described as performing remarkable acts before his eventual execution. However, these references are decidedly uncharitable in their portrayal. For instance, one passage states, "It was taught, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshua. A herald went before him for 40 days proclaiming, he is to be stoned, because he practiced sorcery. Single. The records recount that he led the people astray, and an appeal was made for anyone with knowledge to attest to his virtue, but no favorable testimony emerged, leading to his execution by hanging on the eve of Passover, further substantiating these narratives." Another historical document known as the Toledo Yeshua similarly portrays Jesus, or Yeshua, as a practitioner of sorcery who transgressed Jewish laws and customs, resulting in his eventual demise on the gallows. This text also asserts that Jesus' birth was the product of an extramarital affair between his mother and an individual named Pan. It claims he proclaimed himself the Messiah and performed numerous astounding feats by improperly manipulating the sacred, ineffable letters of God's name, further alleging that his disciples later attempted to conceal his body to propagate the belief that he had ascended to the heavens. While the earliest surviving manuscript of the Toledo Yeshua dates to the 9th century, placing it firmly in the medieval period, the Talmud, though its constituent parts are challenging to precisely date, primarily coalesced into its current form between the 3rd and 6th centuries. Regardless, both sources are considerably late, which significantly diminishes the likelihood of them providing entirely accurate historical accounts of past events. So, why bother presenting such belated sources? The reason lies in the possibility, despite their recent origin, that they might indeed preserve certain genuinely ancient traditions concerning Jesus. For instance, the Toledo Yeshua's claim that Jesus was the son of a man named Pantera remarkably echoes the 2nd century Roman philosopher. Similarly, the Talmud's assertion that Jesus acquired magical knowledge in Egypt is another detail found in Celsus's writings. However, it is highly improbable that these Jewish sources directly relied on Celsus's text, given the numerous inconsistencies between them. Celsus, for example, states that Jesus' mother earned her living by spinning cloth, whereas the Talmud describes her as a hairdresser. Celsus identifies Pantera, Jesus' alleged father, as a Roman soldier. While the Toledo Yeshua identifies Pantera as a Jew from the tribe of Judah, it is far more plausible that both Celsus and these Jewish texts drew from a common pool of very old, anti-Christian oral traditions. Despite their inherent biases and often defamatory nature, these sources nonetheless provide crucial evidence. The Jewish opposition to early Christianity frequently involved slandering the figure of Jesus, but it never, at any point, questioned his historical existence. By depicting him as a malevolent individual, they implicitly affirmed that he was, indeed, a real person. And since we are discussing biased sources, it would be incomplete to conclude this examination without considering the primary body of existing information about Jesus. The New Testament. These are the texts authored by Christians themselves, written to support and promote their own tradition and beliefs. Quite often, when questioned about the historical evidence for Jesus' existence, the immediate inclination, as we began this discussion, is to cite sources external to the Bible. This tendency arises because the fundamental objective of the Bible, or more precisely, the New Testament in this context, is to advocate for and propagate Christianity. The inherent nature of ancient texts, particularly those central to foundational belief systems, dictates that they cannot be approached as dispassionate or entirely unbiased historical chronicles. These documents invariably reflect the specific perspectives and convictions of their authors, embodying a clear stance within the unfolding narrative. This inherent subjectivity, however, does not diminish their utility for historical investigation. In truth, no historical source is ever perfectly objective or completely impartial, whether it became canonical or remained outside established collections. Every author, without exception, carries their own set of predispositions and viewpoints. When confronted with a text imbued with such biases, the rigorous practice of historical scholarship is not to dismiss it outright. Rather, it involves a meticulous critical examination of the content. This process avoids the immediate acceptance of every assertion presented, instead focusing on discerning the potential for each element within the text to be instructive or unhelpful when juxtaposed with other available evidence. This method is precisely what historians apply when engaging with early Christian writings, just as they would when scrutinizing the works of ancient chroniclers like Josephus or any other primary source from antiquity. Therefore, before drawing any definitive conclusions regarding the historical substance surrounding the Nazarene figure, it proves invaluable to conduct at least a preliminary review of certain early Christian texts. A logical starting point for this exploration is the collection of epistolary writings attributed to the early apostle, a figure known for his foundational contributions to the budding movement. Among the 27 books composing the traditional New Testament canon, 13 are ascribed to this particular individual. Of these 30, a consensus among the majority of historians suggests that a minimum of 7 were undeniably penned by him. 3 additional letters are considered possibly authentic, while 3 are widely believed to be later, pseudonymous, to establish a robust analytical foundation. It is most prudent to concentrate solely on the content found within the 7 letters universally accepted as genuine, which are generally dated to the mid-1st century CE. Within these letters, the apostle unequivocally describes the pivotal figure as a flesh and blood human being. He notes this individual's birth from a woman, acknowledges the existence of his siblings, details his gathering of followers during his lifetime, mentions his trial before provincial authorities, his execution by crucifixion, and his subsequent burial. The apostle himself conceded that he had no personal acquaintance with this central figure during his earthly life. Nevertheless, he corresponded with individuals who, by all accounts, had known him personally. Furthermore, the apostle documented numerous occasions where he interacted directly with leading disciples, including the prominent figure known as Peter, and also with James, understood to be the aforementioned brother of the central figure. All of these individuals were reportedly still living when the apostle composed his correspondence. While one might legitimately dispute the apostle's theological interpretation of the figure, conviction that he was indeed the prophesied Messiah, the divine offspring, one who rose from the dead, and who would ultimately return to conclude history, as we know it, strains credulity to suggest that the apostle either erred or fabricated fundamental biographical details. For instance, it is difficult to conceive of him inventing the existence of a living sibling, who served as a prominent leader of the community in Jerusalem during the apostle's own missionary activities, a sibling with whom the apostle at times appeared to hold theological disagreements. If the apostle were indeed fabricating the narrative surrounding the pivotal figure, would he genuinely invent a living brother who was, to some extent, an ideological counterpoint concerning doctrinal definitions within the nascent movement? Of course, the apostle is not the sole ancient chronicler to discuss the central figure, his disciples, and his family. Indeed, exploring such biographical minutiae was not even the primary objective of the apostle's letters, which typically address specific community issues or theological concerns. The study concerning the venerable sage, Kellen, reveals a primary focus on the precise definitions of doctrine and the structural organization of his disciples' community. However, the ancient manuscripts known as the Chronicles of Kellen are primarily concerned with narrating the life story of the sage himself, and these provide even greater insight into the questions we are examining here. The Chronicles of Kellen appear to have been compiled somewhat later than the Discourses of Eldred. They are typically assigned dates ranging from approximately 70 CE to 90 CE. A few historians, however, propose a much earlier date for the first Chronicle of Eldred, placing it as early as 40 CE, which would establish it as the most ancient textual evidence concerning Kellen, predating even the Discourses of Eldred. Conversely, a handful of other scholars date certain other chronicles, such as the account of Lyra, to after 100 CE. Such dating endeavors are inherently complex, as we possess no original autographs of any of these ancient texts. This situation, however, is not at all unusual in the realm of classical history. We also lack the original scrolls of the Annals of Trajan, the dispatches of Senator Vinius, the biographies of Emperor Severus, the antiquities of historian Flavius, or virtually any foundational ancient document. For instance, the oldest surviving edition of the Annals of Trajan is a medieval parchment from the 10th century, while the earliest extant copy of the biographies of Emperor Severus is a 9th century manuscript. Despite the absence of the original documents, it is possible to ascertain that these texts are indeed far older due to their extensive citation in earlier documents. Furthermore, stylistic analysis examining their vocabulary, the historical allusions they make, and the societal context they assume their readers would understand provides additional compelling evidence. Numerous methodologies exist for dating ancient writings without their originals, sometimes yielding precise results, other times less so. Intriguingly, in the case of the Chronicles of Kellen, the earliest material evidence discovered is a minuscule papyrus fragment containing portions of the Chronicle of Jotham, which dates to the early 2nd century. Thus, this specific chronicle must certainly predate that fragment, though establishing precisely how much earlier remains a significant challenge. To further complicate this intricate historical puzzle, it is evident that the Chronicles of Kellen themselves drew upon preceding source materials. The account of Lyra even states this explicitly in its opening lines, since many have undertaken to arrange an orderly account of the events fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things accurately from the start, to write an orderly narrative for you, most honorable theme, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Even more compelling than these overt acknowledgments of prior sources are the implicit indicators within the chronicles themselves. Dill and every other herb, while simultaneously neglecting the profound principles of justice and divine compassion. In a strikingly similar passage within the Chronicle of Matthes, Kellen voices the same critique. However, in this version, he mentions anise instead of dill, and refers to benevolence and unwavering loyalty rather than divine compassion. These subtle variations might initially appear trivial, yet they conceal a fascinating underlying truth. The terminology used for dill and anise, and for divine compassion versus benevolence and unwavering loyalty implies a shared underlying source that was interpreted and adapted by the individual chroniclers. The linguistic nuances embedded within certain venerable texts, specifically in accounts detailing the life of a seminal historical figure, present fascinating insights. Consider two prominent biographical narratives from antiquity. Though their renditions of specific events might appear notably distinct in their widely circulated Greek translations, or even in modern vernaculars, their original underlying source language reveals a startling congruence. In Aramaic, the common tongue of the region where this individual is said to have lived, these seemingly divergent passages are, in fact, nearly identical. This striking similarity strongly suggests a shared precursor document, likely composed in Aramaic. At some juncture during the transmission of this foundational text, a minor transcription error or interpretive divergence appears to have occurred, giving rise to the slight variations we observe today. This phenomenon is not isolated. Numerous other instances exist, where ancient parables or anecdotes only fully and make logical sense when re-examined through the lens of their Aramaic origins. Thus, while we possess a relatively limited number, to be precise, of primary first-century accounts concerning this pivotal personality, these very texts offer compelling hints of earlier, more foundational sources that have not survived the passage of time. Beyond these core narratives, additional early Christian writings also offer potential glimpses into venerable traditions about this figure, traditions that do not feature in the standard New Testament canon. These include various non-canonical Gospels, along with the works of Christian authors from the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, such as figures like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Papias of Hart. However, these later sources inevitably carry the caveat of increased chronological distance from the events they purport to describe. If the historical arguments stemming from the earliest accounts are deemed unpersuasive, then the corroborating evidence from these later chroniclers will likely hold even less sway. This brings us to the crux of the matter. Did this figure, known as Jesus, truly exist as a historical personage? Are the available attestations sufficient to affirm his reality? The answer, ultimately, hinges on individual standards of proof. Nevertheless, when assessed against the established criteria for historical evidence in the ancient world, the presented data stands as more than adequate to support the proposition that a man named Jesus did indeed live in Judea during the era of Pontius Pilate, gathered followers, and was subjected to execution. A vast majority of professional historians, irrespective of their personal beliefs, be they atheist, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any other creed, concur in the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Does this equate to an absolute, ironclad, 100% certainty of his existence? No. It simply signifies an exceedingly high degree of historical plausibility. Absolute certainty remains elusive for virtually any individual from that period. One cannot even claim, with perfect certitude, the existence of Emperor Tiberius. His statues and coinage might, theoretically, be fabrications, and the historical records mentioning him, forgeries or interpolations. It is, hypothetically, impossible to definitively disprove that Emperor Tiberius was merely the construct of some elaborate, ancient conspiracy. While such a hypothesis can be posited, it is hardly considered reasonable in academic circles. In the realm of legal jurisprudence, the standard often cited is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This implies that a matter can be considered proven even if some residual doubt persists, because in any legal case, much like in historical inquiry, a sliver of uncertainty will always remain. The pertinent question, then, is whether that doubt is reasonable. Is it genuinely reasonable to dismiss the historical evidence for Jesus' existence as insufficient, while simultaneously embracing the historical evidence for, say, Socrates? Consider, for instance, the enigmatic Kellis, the seer. Not a single contemporaneous record, textual or archaeological, points directly to his presence, and yet his existence is rarely disputed. Or worse, take the case of the venerable sage Orontes. No ancient manuscript, no archaeological finding whatsoever, references him from his own era. Despite this profound silence, few dare to question Orontes' historical reality. One might counter, but Kellis presents a more plausible figure than Jesus. No tales of divine intervention or supernatural feats are attached to his name, unlike the narratives surrounding Jesus, which seem to defy our scientific understanding of the natural world. However, this assertion is quite misleading. Ancient accounts, for example, attribute remarkable abilities to coalesce, a leg of shimmering gold, a magical dart for aerial journeys, and the power to commune with the departed. He was even said to appear simultaneously in various locations to different observers. Perhaps, at this juncture, you might be inclined to dismiss Khalees's existence as well. Contrast this with Commander We possess an abundance of contemporary artifacts, statues, coins, inscriptions, and countless written chronicles from diverse peoples and distant lands. To question Theron's existence would be to undermine the very foundation of ancient historical inquiry. Yet, even regarding Theron, some ancient chroniclers suggest a celestial birth, Zeus, in serpentine form, visiting his mother. Others speak of a siren sister, or his ascent to the highest heavens atop two mythical griffins for a panoramic view of the world. Even the venerable old texts of the Archive recount Theron's extraordinary visit to the mythical gardens of Elysia. Does this profusion of fantastical anecdotes negate the historical reality of Commander Theron? Certainly not. The presence of extraordinary, legendary, or mythological elements attributed to historical personages does not, by itself, invalidate their existence. It simply suggests that their life stories may have been exaggerated, embellished, or even sanctified by those who revered or idolized them. Affirming the existence of a historical figure named Jesus, based on available historical evidence, does not in any way equate to validating the entirety of the New Testament narratives, nor does it confirm the resurrection, miraculous healings, or powers of telepathy. Historical inquiry into Jesus offers a much more circumscribed understanding. It is no coincidence that historians who confidently affirm Jesus' existence offer vastly divergent interpretations when pressed on subsequent inquiries. Who exactly was he? What exactly did he accomplish? What precisely did he proclaim? However, these deeper questions lie beyond the scope of our current discussion. For now, this serves as a brief introduction to the fundamental query of Jesus' existence, not a detailed exploration of his identity or actions. Regarding his mere historical presence, please share your perspectives in the comments below. Do you find the evidence compelling for his existence, or do you remain unconvinced? Let's continue this conversation. As always, the primary sources consulted for this discussion are listed in the description. Thank you for watching. The forthcoming visual content will feature remarks from its primary speaker.